Hey guys, welcome back to building a basic website from scratch. Last class we talked about CSS and we added some styles to our type, basic font sizes and some basic colors as well and sizes for our headings using modular scale. This time what we're going to do is we're going to look into building a table, and we're going to build a table very similar to this. The idea of this table is that you create it with the hopes that you will have these kind of shortcuts where you can just copy and paste this code and reuse it within your site in case you needed to know kind of how things look and have a way to display things here. The next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about typography and how we're going to implement it so that we can make our headings and all the other styles that we have here looking better and better. So go ahead and join me, and we're going to start creating this table right here. So let's go ahead and start creating our table. Now, the purpose of a table is to hold tabular data. Usually you would use tables to hold contents such as numbers and information, something that needs to be seen in a table format. Anything that you would actually use, say for example, Excel in, then that's something that you would want to use a table for in HTML to display that type of content. In our case, we are going to use it just to display our headings, and then later on we're going to add also our typography as well, something like the paragraphs with some styles like bold, italics, and whatnot, just so that we have it and we can visibly see it all in one place. So let's go ahead and start building that table. The first thing that we need to do, again, we're going to use our tags, our HTML tags, and the tag that we're going to use is, guess what? Table. Table is not a self-closing tag, so you definitely need to have an opening and closing. You notice again we're indenting so that we can go into the content itself and start building that table. Now, tables for most of the part are composed of three main sections. The first section that you can think about will be the caption, which this one will tell what the table is about. For example, in our case, this table is a reference for the heading styles. All right. The second section that we're going to talk about, or we're going to add in our table, is going to be our table header, or the kind of the headings for our table itself. So that's done with a tag called T-head. All right. And then we also have another content section called T-body. Does that look anything similar to what we had up here? Remember, we had our HTML, our head, and our body. Same thing here. We have our table, head, and body. Tables are actually one of the oldest markup that we have available. These, believe it or not, back in the 1990s, we used to use tables to lay out content in a site. Definitely not responsive. Definitely, I mean, at that point, we didn't have mobile devices that could access the internet, but definitely not easy to create or design layouts with it, but it's what we had available, so that's what we used. So again, we have table, T-head, T-body. Now, if you think about it, each one of our sections, if you think about, for example, an Excel sheet, you have it composed of cells, and you also have both rows and columns. So we can do the same way, something very similar here with HTML. So in our markup, what we're going to do in our T-head, we're going to add a table row, which is TR. Again, not a self-closing tag here. This table row will contain cells inside of it. So for example, we can do something like TH, which is our table head. Our table head would be implemented inside of the T-head. Table header will be implemented inside of the T-head tag. So here we can say something like table 1.1 HTML headings, something along the lines of that. If we save this and we go into Firefox and refresh this, then you'll see that we have our table right here. We have, this is our caption, this is a table, is a reference for the heading styles, and our table 1.1 headings. Well, let's go ahead and add another row here. TR, table row, and let's add another table heading where we're going to do that. Maybe we're going to call it markup. And that markup is where where you saw in the initial screenshot, is where we have the actual markup that we're going to have for that whatever element that we're building on. And then the next one is going to be maybe something like th example. So that way it would actually be rendered in there. Now, if you notice here, you'll see that we have markup and we have example. But if you pay attention to here, let's go ahead and add another markup real quick to the table. And we're going to remove this as we go further on, but I would like for you to see what's happening. So let's go ahead and do a border equals quote one, close quote, and then save that up. And if we go back to our markup, then you'll see that now this table is a full table, and it has this table heading right here. It has another table heading, and then it also has another table heading up here. But if you notice, this top portion right here, this first table row that we added, is not expanding completely. So why do you think that's happening? The reason why that happens is because each table heading or each table cell is aligned to the table cells provided before or after it. So then, for example, in this case, because this table cell right here, this table heading right here is occupying only one cell, then that's why the markup is a lot wider than, for example, the example heading. What we're going to do is we're going to add this attribute called call span equals to 2. Again, remember to add the quotes in between the two. So what this is going to do is that when we go in here, you'll see that this table is now occupying 2 columns. Call span occupies 2 columns. The same thing could be done, for example, if, let's go ahead and remove this real quick. And let's go ahead and revert this. Let's add markup on the top, an example. And then you'll see that, for example, when we refresh this, the markup and example are occupying 2 spaces, and then this table 1.1 HTML headings is occupying only a single cell. So if we wanted to, what could we do to make this markup maybe occupy 2 rows? So in order to do that, we need to go to the markup tag and add the attribute called row span equals to 2. What this is saying is vertically from top to bottom, I want this cell to occupy 2 spaces. So now you see that this markup is now occupying 2 spaces, and it made this table 1 shove to the right so that it can occupy that space. What if we were to do it to the other one, to example instead? Well, let's take a look at that. If we do it to the example instead, then example will occupy 2 spaces, and then table 1.1 and markup will be within the same cell. But if you notice by looking at the border around it, right, then we can see that now this is occupying 2 cells, 2 rows, 1 cell. This one is occupying 1 cell each. So let's go ahead and bring this back. We're going to move this table 1.1 all the way to the top up here. And because we want this table 1.1 to span into 2 columns, right, 2 cells, let's go ahead and add the call span equals to 2. Save that and refresh it, and now we have it there. All right, so that's all we're gonna do for our table heading area, or table head, T-head. The next thing that we need to do is add now our body components. So if you think about it, we have table rows and table headings on the table head. So we need to do the same thing for our T-body. So we need to add a table row. And inside of that table row, then we need to add our table cells, which in markup will be TD. Okay, we're just going to add a 1, for example, and then TD2. If you notice, if we were to add another TD over here, or table cell, and we were to refresh our markup, then you'll see that now we have 3 cells, but the ones up top only occupies two columns, right? This one now is 3 different cells, 3 different columns. So let's go ahead and we're gonna remove that real quick. Refresh this. And on the first one, we're going to add our markup. So let's go ahead and let's actually go into adding our display first. So let's go ahead and here we're in the table cell 2, we're going to add our markup. So H1, and it's going to be heading 1, right? If we refresh this, now you can see that we have our heading 1 displaying here. Well, what would we have to do in order to actually show the markup, like that open less than sign and close less than sign, the /, all these things? How would we want to do it? The only way to do that right now is to actually change it and change those different characters and skip them. So what we're going to do is, let me show you real quick. What we're going to do, first of all, is we're going to declare inside of this table cell that the content that we're going to put in there is going to be code. So we're going to use the code HTML tag. If you notice, again, it's not a self-closing tag, so you have an opening and a closing one. And then inside of it, what we're going to do is we're going to use the ampersand LT semicolon. What this means is less than. This replaces or creates that less than sign. So if we were to go to the markup to Firefox, then you'll see it there. It's now showing that less than sign. Let me go ahead and delete a little bit of code that I had added here before. Less than sign. You'll see that right there. Now, if LT is less than sign, then what do you think will be for the greater than sign? And I think you guessed it, which is GT. Ampersand GT semicolon has that less than the greater than sign. So we need this for this section of code here. And what we're going to do is we're going to copy this, because we have an opening and a closing, and then the / or the / I'm sorry, is just going to be that, just a /. So here what we're going to enter is going to be our H1, and when we refresh our page, you'll see that right here. And when we refresh our page on Firefox, then you'll see that now we have our H1 here and our closing H1 here. Now that we've done these, we can use our trusty copy and paste. So we have heading 2, heading 3, heading 4, heading 5, heading 6, and all we have to do now here is going to be update each one of these headings so that it actually reflects which heading we're actually displaying and showing. So here again, we're doing heading 1, heading 2, now we're going to heading 3 and making that update. Now, most of the time, I personally only use up to heading 4, and I think I mentioned that in my last video, at least in one of the videos before, because I don't find a lot of benefit of having the heading 4 or heading 5 or heading 6 be used. So for the most part, I usually stop at heading 4, but I'm doing it just for the sake of you guys having this information and remembering that you do have a heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, heading 4, and heading 5. So here we're doing that. We're just updating this. Again, in this case, don't forget that you also need to copy your table row. Don't forget you have to copy that TR. If you only copy the TDs, which is the table cells, then you'll have several cells going to the right rather than rather than different rows for this table. So after you've done that update to the table cells, you can go back to your HTML onto your Firefox, and then you'll see, okay, we have heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, heading 4, heading 5. See, heading 4 very similar to the same font size as the typography as the general paragraph. Heading 5 is a little bit smaller. Heading 6 is even smaller. So now we have our markup for our table. Let's go ahead and start adding some styles to this table. Now this table, you notice that it has that border all around it, and then it has this border inside of each one of the cells. So that's something that we also need to make sure that we have that into our CSS. So let's go into our CSS, and we're going to start adding our basic styles for the table. So we're gonna go all the way to the bottom below our H6, and we're going to add a comment. We're just going to add something like table styles, just so that we know where the table styles start and where the table styles end. So here we're going to have that. If you remember, in order to select an HTML element, here we're trying to select this table element. What we need to do is type in the word table in our CSS. In order to collapse these kind of two borders that you have here, what we need to do is use something called border collapse and then collapse. When you save that, then you'll see now the borders are collapsed, and now it looks like it's just a single border. Let's go back to our HTML, and let's go ahead and remove this border here. Now that is our basic border from the table, but we want to be able to manage all styles from our CSS. So what we're going to do next is we're going to add border styles to our table. If you go over here, we refresh, the borders are no longer there. Now, in order to add border styles, there's three main styles that we need to add to the border for it to work. So the first thing is going to be our border width, which in our case, we're just going to do 1 pixel. Here you can use all of the different measures that we've talked about in the past. So we talked about pixels, we talked about EMs, we also talked about REMs, and I believe you can also use percentages. For the most part though, I have seen tables or table widths only be used with pixels because you want to try to keep them as minimum as possible, but you could try all the other measures of units as well. So if we refresh here, nothing happens because we need 3 styles for it to display properly on the page. So we have border width. The second one is going to be border style. In here, you can actually do something like, for example, solid, you can do dash, you can do dotted. I would actually have a link to the different border styles so that in the description of the video, so that you can see it and kind of go and try those out. We're going to stick with solid because, again, for the most part, it's the one that is mostly used. And the third style we need to add for border is going to be our border color. And here we're just going to say black. Okay. So with those 3 styles, we have now our border width, style, and color. And if we go back to our Firefox or our browser, if we refresh, now we have that border all around our table. But remember, we used to have other borders around here, and those borders are going to be applied to our table cells and our headings as well, or table headings. So let's go back into our table styles, and let me show you something. Remember how we talked about margin, and we talked about if, for example, if you had 1 value, that value would be applied to all the sides, 2 values, 3 values, 4 values. So all of those things that we talked about margin. So if you notice, we could have potentially done something like margin top 0, margin bottom 0, margin left 0, margin right 0. This is the same thing as declaring each one of those values, but because we only are zeroing it out, then we are combining all of this into just the margin attribute. All right, so let's go ahead, and the reason why I wanted to reinforce that is because now if we look over here, we could potentially do the same thing with border as well. So we could do something like border top width 1 pixel, border top style solid, border top color black. And if we were to refresh that over here, now you see that that border is only on the top. And then if we really wanted this to be, this way, then we could do it right, left, bottom. But if you notice, that's a lot of code for just adding a border all around our table. So one of the things that we can do is consolidate all of those border styles that we have, the attributes like width, style, and color, into a single border attribute. So what we can do is do border, colon, and then 1 pixel, which is our border width, solid, which is our border style, and then black or 000, 000, 000, 6 zeros, and that will be the same thing as black, or we could just say black. Now, if we were to comment these border styles out up here, then you'll see when we refresh our page, it's still the same thing. And now, for example, what if we just wanted the top border to be that? Then we do border top, and then we just give those 3 attributes rather than having to spell them out this way. I just wanted to make sure that you guys understood where each one of these values is coming from and where and how you're able to edit those styles. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to minimize that border style so that we have a little more space. And we're just going to use that border 1 pixel solid black to define our border itself. Now, one thing that I don't like is that this table is so narrow here. I much rather have it span the full width of whatever container it's in. In our case right now, the container is our main tag, which is inside of our body tag. And we haven't set up any widths anywhere else in these documents. So let me show you something. Let's go ahead and add an attribute called width. Now, width allows for you to give a specific width to whatever element you're trying to edit. So for example, here, you can give it a width of, say, for example, 48 EMs. And that will be 48, right, multiplied times the HTML or body size, depending on which one. So since this is 1 EM, which is the same as 20 pixels. So it will be 48, 20 pixels. Again, the multiplication on that. So we can do this and just refresh, and you'll see that now it became a little bit bigger. Now, the next thing that we can do is, instead of just using for example, a very rigid, even though it's flexible because it changes based on the font size, but it's very rigid because it doesn't take into consideration the width of the browser. What we can do instead is we can use something like 100%. And if we were to do 100%, then now this occupies all the way from the left all the way to the right of the container. And if you notice, there's not a scroll bar on the bottom to move it from the left to right. So again, we're expanding this table so that it can occupy 100% of the width of the whatever parent container it's being contained on. Okay, so that's something else that we can do. Later on, we're going to talk about max width, min width, height, min height, max height, and then some other units that we're able to use. Right now, we're just going to keep it very simple, and we're just going to give it a width of 100% so that, again, it expands as much as the whatever container it has allows for it. Okay. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to add our styles for each one of our different table cells. So here, let's go ahead and again, in the past, we kind of talked about this example where we're concatenating, we're adding the same style to all these different elements. But one of the benefits of using CSS is that you can be very specific as you select elements. So here one thing that we can do is, for example, we could easily do just TD, comma, TH, right? Which will be our table cells and our table headings. But even though you may not necessarily have it programmed or use those somewhere else, we may want to be a little more specific. So one of the things that we can do is use the table, the parent element, and then use something like TD, table, TH. So now we're selecting the table cell inside of this table element. Notice that there's a space between the two selectors and there's no commas or anything that separates them. If we were to look at the markup, then you'll see that we have our table, and the table is a parent of the table heading as well as the table cell. If we wanted to be more specific, we could definitely do table, T-head, TR, TH. But if you don't follow this pattern, for example, the T-head or T-body, then it might not necessarily look as good. So we are going to try to be a little bit broader on this selection here. So in our table cells, in our table headings, we're going to do the same thing with our border. So we're going to select our border. We're going to add it here. We're going to save it. And once we refresh it in the browser, then you'll see now we have each one of our borders back. So now you have created your first table. However, I think we can do a little bit better than this. If we go back into our table cell and our table heading, you'll notice that they're kind of very close to the lines. Maybe we can give them a little bit more room for the content to be able to breathe in there. So let's go ahead and add our padding. Remember, we added padding in our body tag, and we zeroed it out. Now what we want to do is give it a little bit more breathing room inside of our table cells. So what we're going to do is we're going to do padding of 1 rem. Hopefully you guys remember that if we set a padding with a single value, this single value affects both top, bottom, left, and right of the whatever element that we are in. So if we want to go back to our browser and refresh this, now you'll see that we have a little more room between our table cells and our table headings inside. So each content inside of the table cell or inside of the table headings has a little more space. What's the second thing that you notice in here? Hopefully you guys have noticed that you have these content inside of the table cells, but they're all towards aligned in the middle of the page or in the middle of the cell. Most everybody might want to think about this and maybe move it towards the top or maybe towards the bottom. Depends on what you're trying to do. So here what we're going to do is we're going to add vertical, align, and here you have the option of top. Vertical align is the attribute that we're going to use for our table cells or table heading to align that vertically inside of the cell. If you notice when we refresh in the browser, now our H1s, H2, H3, the markup portion moved up. Now this heading 1, heading 2, heading 3 did not move, but it's not because it's not aligned to the top. The reason why it's not moving is because if we were to inspect it, each one of our heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, heading 4, heading 5, and heading 6 still has some margin that has been assigned by the browser. So if we were to say, for example, margin 0, then you'll see how all of them kind of moved a little bit more. If we were to have more content, then on say for example, if we're to have more content on the markup, then these would definitely align towards the top. We're not going to do that. Again, this is just one quick way for you to test out your HTML, your CSS. But we're going to close this and refresh. But trust me, they are aligned towards the top. Whenever we come back to add a little more styles in typography, then this should look a little bit better. So now that we've done that, we've aligned each one of our markups or table cells or table headings towards the top. The next thing that we can do is going to be maybe making all the elements to be aligned to the left. Now we could leave these table headings, for example, aligned to the center, but let's go ahead and change that. Let's go ahead and make it so that everything, both the table cells and table headings, are aligned to the left. The way that you will do that is going to be by using the attribute text align, colon, and then here you can do left. If you go back to the browser and you refresh it, then whatever was in the center is now left aligned. Now, I would like for you guys to also look in here and think about it. For example, maybe you can do center instead, and then everything will be aligned to the center. You can do right as well, and then you can align everything to the right. And if I'm not mistaken, you can use justify as well, and it will justify the text. We don't have enough text in here to justify it, but know that it is justify. So here we're going to just make it into the left. For vertical align, you also have three options. You have top, you have middle, which is the default value for our table cells and table headings. And then you can also do bottom. If we were to do that, then now you see everything is aligned towards the bottom of the cell. So, but again, in our case, we're going to make sure that it is aligned to the top. Now, here we were applying the same styles for our table cells and table headings, but what if we just want to apply styles to our table headings? So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Let's go ahead and create another selector, and we're going to do table space th to select our table heading. And here what we can do is say, for example, change the color to be something like black 000000. And if we go into our browser and refresh, then you'll see our table headings are now black. What if we wanted our table headings to be all uppercase? Then we could also do that. For example, we could do text, transform, and here you can do something like uppercase. And then all of them will transform to uppercase. We can do also lowercase. And then all of them will become lowercase, or you can use something like capitalize. And then if you refresh it, then they will be capitalized as well. So here, again, that's an option for you to figure out and see if you would like to use it. I am going to try to keep it simple and just use a change of colors for our markup itself. And I think our table is pretty much done. Now, one thing that I don't like is our caption for our table to be all the way up here. Maybe we can make some changes to the caption. So one of the things that we can do is go into our table and select our caption. And here what we can do is we can actually do something like caption side. And in caption side, you have top, but you also have bottom. Now, if we refresh this, you'll notice that our caption disappeared and it actually went to the bottom of the table. If you go to our HTML, our markup for the caption is still on the top of the table. However, our styles made it so that it went to the bottom portion of our table. That's a better style or look for it. One of the things that we can also do here is we can make it so, for example, we can add some padding to it. Maybe we can do one REM. maybe we can make the font size a little bit smaller. So instead of using a font size of 1 EM, which is the default by the body tag right here, you see that? Let's go ahead and make it a little bit smaller. So let's go do something like 0.8 REM, and then do a line height of 1 EM. This will make it so that, again, this multiplies, right, against the body size, which then in turn multiplies towards the HTML font size. And then the line height is a multiplication. So this size, or 1 EM, is going to be the same, whatever value comes up from 0.8 REM. If we refresh our page, then you'll see our table caption is a little bit smaller, and it's still, it's still legible, at least in my case here. Again, please feel free to make edits on yours to make it look better. One other thing we can do for the caption is, for example, let's go ahead and instead of using the same color, right, because it kind of blends with the next the content after it. One thing that we can do is maybe add a background color. So we can do background color, and then we can do black. That background color then will turn into black. Let's change that color, instead of this very light gray, to a different color, something like color, and then something like let's see, FA, which is a very light gray. Now if we refresh that, now we're able to see that caption, and again we are able to still style it more and send it to one of the sides. So text align right. We can do that, and now our caption can be towards the right. We can do it towards the left. We can do it towards the center, and we're just going to keep it in the center. It looks a little bit better there. And we've done all of our styles here. These are the basic styles for our table markup. Now, this right now is not too bad because we just have only 6 rows, table rows, and really the content it has a lot of breathing space and whatnot. But what would happen if you were to have a lot of content in there? Maybe you want something to highlight or stylize the table so that it has a little bit more, it's a little bit easier for the user to read and know when a column, a row starts and where it ends. So one of the things that we can do is we can add styles to edit this specific table that we created, and maybe add a little bit more styles that will be applied to that table. So let me explain what I'm trying to do. If we go back to our markup, you'll see here in our HTML that we only created a table. If you look at the styles, we've only selected styles for that specific table. Now, if we were to put this in human terms, right, and we think about, say, for example, elementary students, right, the moment that we say students, right, it defines all of them, all the students inside of the elementary school. What if I were to say something like 3rd grade students? Then they still are students, but now they have an identifier of 3rd grade. So when I talk about 3rd grade students, then at that point, these 3rd grade students are a subcategory of the students selection that I've made, right? And then if I were to go to John Smith, which is a 3rd grade student, now John Smith is a very individual selection that I have made. In HTML and CSS, you can actually make distinctions from general elements to a group of elements to a very specific elements using special attributes that can be added to your markup. So when we're talking about it is, let's go ahead and talk about, we have made a general selection, what we talked about students. If we wanted to select 3rd grade students, right, a generalization, still part of students, what we can do is we can give it a class of, in our case, we want this table to be striped. So now this table right here has a class of striped. Now, third grade students could also be third grade students classroom A, classroom B, classroom C, which in our case, we could also add another class if we wanted to identify this, so secondary class. Now, you notice that if I have two classes, I have selected, I put the class attribute equals to the colon, and then we add one class, space, and your secondary class over here as well. Now notice that there's no space here. I'm separating them by a dash. You could also do secondary class just like that. But if you were to separate it, then you have one class, two classes, three classes. We'll talk more about that once we start creating our grid system. But in our case, we just want to be able to select this table and give it a general style for, say, a striped table. Later on, I'm going to show you something very specific when we go to my case where we talked about students, third grade students, and then John Smith, which is a third grade student. We'll go into that in just a little bit. So now that we have selected this class, again, we have a table with a class of striped. This is called a this is called a class, which is another thing that you can add to your selector to specify that this table is different than other tables. Now you could have, for example, let's go ahead and I'm going to copy this table and I am going to paste it. And on the second table, I'm going to remove that class of striped. Okay. If we go to our HTML, our browser, if we refresh, right now, both tables are the same. And the reason why is because we haven't added any classes or any styles to our class of striped. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. We're going to go at our CSS. We have our table styles. This is our general table styles. If you notice, we have our table, table cell, table heading styles, and table caption. Now, if we wanted to add other styles, then we can go in and right below that, we can do table with a class of striped. This period right here tells me that this is a table, and this period lets me know that this class right here belongs to this table. Notice that there's no separation between the two. Right here you have table, class, or striped. If you were to have multiple classes, again, we'll look at this in the future, then this will be the secondary class. Again, everything, all of them are placed with a period and they're all together. Now, what would happen if we were to do this? If we were to separate the table with a class of stripe space and another class of secondary class, what that's doing is the same thing as, for example, table caption. What our CSS is going to look for is going to look for a table with a class of striped, and inside of it is going to try to look for another element that has this secondary class. So in our case, we're not going to do that just yet, but what we're going to do is we're going to add more selections here so that we can make some changes to it. So in our case, what we're going to do is our table with a class of striped we're going to change our table heading. And we're going to do something similar to what we did to the caption. We're going to add a background color of black, and then we're going to change the heading color to that FA. And then we're going to go in and refresh this. Now you'll notice that we have this table heading here, right? And this one that has the class of striped has this black background with the white text. But if you scroll down below it, you'll notice that this one wasn't affected, and it's because it doesn't have that class. So let's go ahead and instead of doing that black, let's go ahead and change it into a very dark gray, like 2222. And if we refresh here, then you can still kind of see the lines a little bit, but again, it kind of changes that style. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a background color to every one of our odd rows. So in order to do that, we're going to use our table, striped, TR, but we don't want all of our TRs, right? We want only the ones within our body tag. So what we're going to do is we're going to do T body, TR, table row, and we're going to do background color. And then here, let's do something like that FA. All right, just to see how that looks. And when we refresh here, wait a minute, all of these rows change that color. But I just want it to be selected on our first, third, fifth row, which is our odd rows, right? Row 1, 3, 5, 7, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Let's go ahead and we're going to add something that is called a pseudo selector. We will talk about this maybe a little bit more. I will have links in the description if you would like to learn more about different ways to select elements in CSS so that you can dive a little bit deeper into selectors and whatnot. It's definitely a good practice and you can go look at it. But here we're going to use a very basic one. And what we're going to do with this pseudo selector is in order to do that, inside of our table row, without any spaces, we're going to add a colon, and then we're going to do nth or nth child, and then open close parenthesis. And here we're going to say, we want you to select just the odd rows. Here, what this is saying, if we were to read it in English, is saying inside of our table with a class of striped, inside of our table body, select the table row that is an odd table row. So when we save this, let's go ahead and make this a little bit darker. So we're going to do something like EF. When we save that, we go to the browser and refresh it. Then now you'll see it only selects the first, the third, and the fifth of those rows. If you wanted to go the other way, you could also do even. And then instead you will select the second, the fourth, and the sixth. So again, we're just going to stick with odd, and that will make that selection there. And in our case, because this kind of has that dark gray, let's go ahead and change our table caption for that dark gray as well. So table, striped, and then caption. Again, inside of a table with a class of stripe, there is a caption that we're selecting, and we're going to do the background color EF, and save that. Oh, I'm sorry, not EF. 2, 2, 2, 2, 6 twos. There you go. And now we refresh that, and now you'll see we have this table caption that has the same color as these table headings. And then if we keep on scrolling, this other table that we created that doesn't have a class in there, right? Then at that point, that one doesn't have any other styles but the basic styles from our table. Now, remember we talked about students, very general, kind of like our table. And then we went a little more specific, which was third grade students, which in our class, in our example, we added a class of striped, right? So we went table, very general, selecting the element, and then we selected a specific class of striped, right? And now what if we wanted to get a very specific, unique element? Okay, then in HTML and CSS, you have this selector called ID. Now, an ID, think about you as a person, you have your name, which, if you're John Smith, then you know that there's another billion people in the world called John Smith. I'm exaggerating, but there's a lot of people called John Smith. But then, for example, if you select human beings, right, that's super general. If we select John Smiths, then that's going to be a little bit more targeted, but it's still very general, right? This applies to a lot of people. But what if John Smith had a social security of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? Then that specific social security or their ID will help identify him separate from everybody else. So the same way here, the IDs are meant to be used as individual selections, very specific, very targeted, compared to classes. Classes can be used over and over, even in the same page. However, IDs should only be used no more than once inside of your page. So here, for example, let's go ahead and call this ID example. All right. Now, again, if we go to the browser, we refresh, nothing happens because we haven't added any styles to that ID. Now, let's go ahead and do the following. We're going to copy this class of striped, and we're going to paste it on our bottom table. You'll see that right here. When we refresh our browser, then you'll see that our styles on the top and our styles on the bottom are the same for right now. Let's go ahead and add a style. Just again, this is going to be testing only, and it's going to be a throwaway, okay? So then here, what we can do is we can go into table, and instead of using striped, let's go use our ID of example. In order to select an ID, right? If we go back up here, you have ID example. Well, in order to select it, classes are use a dot to know and determine that it is a class. IDs use the hashtag or # to be able to select that is an ID. Anytime that you see an ID selected on CSS, it's going to use that pound or hashtag sign. Okay, so what we're going to do is just change the background color, and again, like I said, this is going to be throwaway, but here what we're going to do is we're going to change the background color of our table rows inside of our table body inside of a table with a class of example, and we're going to change that to red. And now you'll see that because we selected that specific ID, even though it has the class of striped, you'll see right here, has a class of striped right here. It's saying this takes more prevalence than this class of striped. Again, we're selecting and determining the difference between one and the next. An ID, because it's very specific, would always override something like a class. Now, notice though that I am using the same style and same selectors. So for example, I'm using the table with an ID instead of a class, and then the T-body, TR, and child. So we could potentially move that to the top, and even though it's above this selector here, right? We talked about CSS, which is cascading style sheets. Everything from the top cascades all the way to the bottom. However, the bottom can override things on the top. But in our case, because the ID of example is a lot more, has more weight in selections than the class of striped, then these overrides this class down here, no matter where it is within the page, as long as we're selecting the same kind of level of elements. If we start taking things apart, then you might have an issue where maybe the style does not apply. But if you're following the same example and kind of just writing overrides, then at that point that will work for you. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to kill this example. You can keep it on your own. You can comment it out if you'd like, but I just wanted to show the difference between an ID and a class. And we're going to do a little bit more of that coming up in our typography, using classes to edit some of our regular styles that we have set up, and then talk a little bit more about other elements here. Now, one of the things that I did notice here as I was looking at this is that if I were to have a table and were to have anything underneath it, it looks like everything's kind of put to like next to each other. There's no separation between this table and this table. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of margin towards the bottom to create a little bit of separation there. So from our table class right here, let's go ahead and add a margin bottom of 1.618 rem. If you remember, you'll see that this 1.618 is the same as the line height that we're using for a lot of our elements. So I just want to keep it similar to each other. And I'm adding it to the table. And again, look, this one is not the striped table or a class or a table with a class of stripe, because I want all of our tables to have a little bit separation from the table to whatever content is below it. So if we were to go to the browser and refresh it, then now we have a little bit more space, creating a little bit of separation between the content from the top to the content on the bottom. If you want to make that larger, then you can do that as well. You can do something like 2.618, and that would add a little bit more space there as well. So that's it for tables. Those are the main styles. We talked about the tables. We talked about the markup for it, which includes the caption, T-head, T-body. We talked about the table rows, which are used in both the T-head and T-body. And we talked about the difference between the table headings and table cells. Now, table headings, one thing that I forgot to mention is that table headings already preset come with the font already bolded and a little bit darker than the rest of the table cells. So that's something that automatically most browsers will have, but it's something that we want to definitely be in control of as we're changing typography and whatnot. So we also talked about call span, which helps a cell span either 2, 3, whatever number we're determining, to the right. And then we also talked about a row span, which also helps a row span or a cell to span more than one row. And we saw how it moved our markup or our table heading, table 1.1 HTML headings, either to the left or to the right, based on if we did it to the markup or to the example table heading when we had them switched over. Again, it cascades from top to bottom, so keep that in mind as you're working on it. We also talked about code, just to determine that the code inside of it is actually HTML code. And one of the things that it's a little bit hard to see here, but it is different, is that we can change later on this code to make it a different color, or change the font itself so that it actually looks a little bit more like code, and it's a little bit nicer to see, and it's a little bit easier to understand that it is not just markup. And we'll change that under the typography video. So we have done that. We created the class. We talked about classes. We talked about IDs, and we'll refine those in just a little bit as we're continuing building our site. For the most part, I don't necessarily use a lot of IDs, but I do use a lot of classes to create whatever content I'm trying to create. So just kind of keep that in mind. You'll see classes more often than you will see IDs. But that's all for tables. We created a table, looked at the differences, added some styles. We looked at pseudo selectors, which again, you'll have a link on the description below to show you a little more information about those selectors and in CSS. We also talked a little bit about font sizes again, and talked a little bit more about padding, and talked about the difference, between we created borders as well, and we created some background colors as well, which is a little bit different from what we've talked about in the past. And we talked about text align as well. So all of these concepts, now you have a foundation to maybe move some things around. For example, this text align here, you could apply text align to your paragraph. You can select all paragraphs and make them align to the left, to the right, to the center. You can justify them, and then you can just test that out. So feel free to do some testing on your own. And in the next video, which is going to be our typography video, we're going to import a font from Google Fonts. We're also going to change some of the colors for the fonts themselves and kind of get those a little bit more set. We're also going to go ahead and set up better sizes and a few more styles to make our typography a little bit more readable. And we're going to create also a little bit more of a responsive font size so that depending on the size of the browser, it's easier to read. So I'll see you guys in the next video.